On the night of April 24, 1980, 8 American helicopters lifted off from the USS Nimitz in the Arabian Sea. Their mission was to fly 500 miles into Iran, land outside Tehran, rescue 53 American hostages being held in the United States Embassy, and get everyone out alive. Not one helicopter made it to Tehran. The operation failed before it even reached the city. 6 Americans died not in combat but in a collision in the desert. The hostages remained in captivity for another 269 days, and the failure of Operation Eagle Claw changed the United States military more profoundly than almost any battle it had ever won. The hostage crisis began on November 4, 1979. Iranian students stormed the American embassy in Tehran and took 66 Americans hostage. They were demanding that the United States return the deposed Shah of Iran, who had fled to America for medical treatment so that he could be put on trial in Iran. President Jimmy Carter refused. The students held the embassy. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The images of blindfolded American diplomats being paraded through the streets of Tehran played on American television every night. By April 1980, the hostages had been held for 172 days. Carter had tried diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, international mediation. Nothing had worked. His approval ratings had collapsed. The election was 8 months away. He authorized the military option. The plan that emerged was called Operation Eagle Claw. It was extraordinarily complex for a reason. Tehran was not a remote compound in the jungle. It was the capital city of a hostile nation of 38 million people. The embassy was in the middle of the city. Getting forces in and out required threading through Iranian air defenses, military patrols, and a civilian population that had been told Americans were the enemy. The plan required 8 RH-53D Sea Stallion helicopters to fly from the Nimitz, 500 miles across the Arabian Sea and into Iran, to a staging area in the Iranian desert code named Desert 1. At Desert 1, the helicopters would refuel from 6 C-130 tanker aircraft that had flown in separately from Egypt. Then the helicopters would fly the Assault Force, a newly formed special operations unit called Delta Force, to a second staging area closer to Tehran. The next night, Delta Force would assault the embassy, free the hostages, move them to a nearby soccer stadium, and helicopters would extract everyone to a captured Iranian airfield outside the city. The plan required everything to work perfectly. Every aircraft, every timing, every element of a chain that stretched 500 miles across a hostile country. Military planners knew the plan was complex. They assessed it as executable. They were wrong. The problems began before the helicopters left the Nimitz. One helicopter was found to have a cracked rotor blade during pre-flight inspection. It was grounded. 7 helicopters launched. The minimum number required to complete the mission was 6. 7 was acceptable but left no margin. The helicopters flew at low altitude across the Arabian Sea and into Iranian airspace to avoid radar detection. What they flew into was something the mission planners had not anticipated: a haboob. A haboob is a type of intense dust storm common in arid regions. The helicopter crews encountered 2 of them on the route into Iran. The dust was so thick that visibility dropped to near zero. The helicopters were flying without lights, without radar, without radio communication that might give away their position. One helicopter turned back. The pilot reported his navigation and flight instruments had malfunctioned in the dust. He could not safely continue. 6 helicopters reached Desert 1. 6 was the minimum. The mission could technically continue. Then the 6th helicopter reported a hydraulic failure. The crew chief had identified a crack in a hydraulic line. Flying a helicopter with that failure into a combat extraction mission over a hostile city was not something the mission commander could authorize. 5 helicopters. The mission could not continue with 5. The commander on the ground, Colonel Charles Beckwith, called the abort. What happened next turned a failed mission into a catastrophe. As the force was preparing to withdraw, One of the RH-53D helicopters repositioned on the ground, and its rotor blades struck one of the C-130 tanker aircraft. Both aircraft caught fire immediately. The explosion in the dark Iranian desert was visible for miles. 5 Americans in the C-130 and 3 in the helicopter died in the fire. The surviving crews abandoned the burning aircraft and evacuated on the remaining C-100s. In the rush to leave, they left behind classified documents. They left behind operational maps. They left behind the bodies of 8 men who had died not in a firefight but in a collision on the ground in a country they had barely entered. The Iranians found everything the next morning. President Carter went on television to announce the failure. He took full responsibility. He said the mission had failed and that he had authorized it and the responsibility was his. It did not help him politically. The images from the Iranian desert, burning American aircraft, American bodies, abandoned equipment, played around the world. Iran's revolutionary government used them as propaganda. The Soviet Union used them as evidence that American military power was in decline. 8 months later, Carter lost the presidential election to Ronald Reagan in one of the largest electoral defeats in American history. The hostages were released on January 20, 1981, the day Reagan was inaugurated. Some believed it was a coincidence. Others have never stopped arguing about it. What Operation Eagle Claw revealed about the American military was devastating. The helicopters had come from different services and had different maintenance standards. The pilots had trained separately. The joint coordination between Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine components of the mission had been inadequate. The C-130 crews and the helicopter crews had never trained together before the mission. The communication protocols between elements were poorly established. The chain of command at Desert One was unclear at critical moments. The after-action review that followed was brutal. A report commissioned by the Joint Chiefs of Staff found that the mission had suffered from inadequate inter-service coordination, poor crew training for the specific mission requirements, and a command structure that had not been sufficiently tested. It recommended the creation of a dedicated Joint Special Operations Command that would train together, operate together, and maintain common standards. That recommendation became the foundation of what is today the United States Special Operations Command. Every Navy SEAL team, every Army Special Forces unit, every Delta Force squadron that operates today does so within a command structure that was built because 8 helicopters failed to reach Tehran in April 1980. The helicopter failures themselves also changed American military aviation. The RH-53D Sea Stallions had experienced mechanical problems in the dust storm that more rigorous pre-mission maintenance might have caught. The training for desert operations had been insufficient. The crews had not been adequately prepared for the specific environmental conditions they would encounter. After Eagle Claw, the military developed entirely new protocols for special operations aviation, new maintenance standards, new crew training requirements for adverse weather and terrain, new helicopter designs that incorporated lessons from the Iranian desert. The MH-60 Black Hawk and MH-47 Chinook variants used by Special Operations Forces today are direct descendants of the engineering and doctrine changes that came from the failure of Eagle Claw. The Delta Force soldiers who were on the ground at Desert One and never got to use their training carried something else away from that night. They had prepared for months. They were ready for the mission. They had trained for the embassy assault, for the extraction, for every contingency they had been asked to anticipate. And they had sat in the Iranian desert and watched the mission die before they ever engaged the enemy. Colonel Beckwith, who had founded Delta Force and led the mission, said afterward that the failure had nothing to do with the men on the ground. The men were ready. The system that delivered them to Desert One was not. He spent the rest of his career working to fix that system. The 53 Americans who remained in the embassy in Tehran after Eagle Claw spent another 269 days in captivity. Some were held in solitary confinement. Some were subjected to mock executions. Some were moved repeatedly around Iran to prevent rescue attempts. They were released on January 20th, 1981, after 444 days in captivity. Every one of them survived. The negotiations that secured their release had been ongoing for months and had nothing to do with military force. They involved Algerian mediators, frozen Iranian assets, and exhausted diplomats on both sides working through the details of an agreement that the incoming Reagan administration had quietly signaled it would honor. Operation Eagle Claw is studied in military academies around the world today, not as a story of what went wrong in the desert, as a story of how failure can be the foundation of something better. The Special Operations Forces that the United States deploys today, in the raids, in the counterterrorism operations, in the hostage rescues that succeed and that you read about in the news, are built on the institutional memory of what did not work in the Iranian desert on the night of April 24, 1980. 8 helicopters that never reached Tehran. 8 men who died in the desert, and a military that spent the next 40 years making sure it would never happen that way again.
Carter took the blame. The hostages came home, the military rebuilt itself from the wreckage, and 40 years later, every special operations raid you read about exists because of one night in the Iranian desert. Thanks for watching. Subscribe so you don't miss the missed story.